is Wednesday, December 17th, 2003, and this is the beginning of an interview with Mr. Roland J. Crismond at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. Mr. Crismond is 77 years old, having been born on June 2nd, 1926. My name is Lynn Lowitz, and I'll be the interviewer. Mr. Crismond, could you state for the recording what war and branch of the service you served in, your rank, and where you served?
I served in the U.S. Navy in World War II. I was a motor machinist mate, second class. Go beyond that where I started, I was one of those people that quit high school to make it to the war. I enlisted in 1944, March the 27th, and started my boot camp at Camp Perry, Virginia, which was a CB base, so we were trained by CBs. After boot camp, I went back, and one of the things, I don't know if it's of interest or not, but during our outgoing unit, we spent our time digging ditches and draining the swamps for the commander who owned the base, since it was part of Dismal Swamps. Following that, I went to a basic engineering school in Richmond, in Gulfport, Mississippi, which taught electrical, boilers, mechanics, just general engineering things. After that, I went to a motor machinist mate school in Richmond, Virginia, which taught diesel engines, and spent several weeks there. One of the things about it is that it went so long and got so boring at times that I would go to sleep a good bit of the time in class. And finally, my job was to get up and clean a crankshaft while the class went on, so I'd stay awake. So one of the things I'll always remember. Following that, I spent 5 days on a train going from Richmond, Virginia to Shoemaker, California, which was considered an outgoing unit. I've since looked on a map for Shoemaker, California, and never found it, but it was somewhere, I know, in the middle of the desert. But while I was there, each day you'd go down and look at the bulletin board to see where you were assigned. And I was assigned to the landing craft school in Coronado, California. And in going there, I was assigned to be a motor machinist mate on a salvage boat. Now, the salvage boat crews trained for some 2 sessions, in that the general boat crews came in and went through probably 8-week training. We went through 8 weeks, and then we went through the salvage portion of it. And following that, we were assigned to a unit of 26 boats. So once we went with that 26 boats, we stayed with them during the whole period. And some humorous things that happened is that we discovered that we were going through the same training set twice. So one of the coxswain on our boat was a veteran of the Navy, and he was smart enough to guide us to get at the end of the line every time we went to class. And as the group went around the corner, we would take off and go to the library or the or the ship service and wait until next chow time. And we went through our second 8 weeks doing that pretty much. However, it all ended up well. After that, I was assigned to the USS Sidney Lanier, and we picked that ship up in Hunters Point, California, which is San Francisco. Once I got on the ship, I'm originally from Virginia, and down in our chow hall was a little 8x10 black and white of Sidney Lanier, Georgia poet. And it's the first time I'd ever paid any attention to the name Lanier. And so anyway, from that point forward, I learned two things. I had my boat duty to do, and our boat was different from other people's because it was a salvage boat. And I'd go to muster each day, and they'd call my name, and after my name I would go and work on my boat. I never did much after that, except I really had my boat in good shape. As time went on, the engineering officer called me. His name was Mr. Roland. And at muster, he announced that we were having a meeting in the boat shack. I went back. I was sitting in the boat shack waiting for him and everybody else for the meeting. He came along and said to me, well, you'll have to get out. I said, no, I'm part of your group. He said, no, no, you're not part of my group. I said, yes, I am. I'm Crismond. I'm engineer on a salvage boat. And he said, well, why haven't I known you before? I said, well, I go to muster each morning and you say Crismond and I say here. And then he got mad at me. You know what I'm talking about. And I said, wait a minute, Mr. Roland. I want to ask a question. And he said, what? I said, were you looking for me for anything? He said, no. I said, well, I wasn't looking for you for anything either. At which time he started laughing. He became my friend throughout the Navy, and after I was discharged, I used to get birth announcements from him. You know, he was, I was an 18-year-old kid, and he was even married at that time and had children. So anyway,
Have you kept up with him? You know?
No, I haven't. In fact, for many years, our skipper used to send out a letter at Christmas. And this went on for many years until he died. And
Do you remember his name?
George Q. McGowan. And now my immediate boss was named McGregor, and he was second in command. And the reason for that was that being engineer on a salvage boat, when we had operations, we also were the command boat. So he was always on the boat doing operations.
If I could just stop you one more
Yes.
second. I'm not really familiar with salvage boats. Could you describe the
Okay.
boat and
Okay.
the people in as much detail?
In fact, that's good because I've made all my notes and then ignored them, of course. The salvage boat was of each, the boats on the ship were 26 boats. And they were the landing crafts that you've seen with a ramp on it where it falls down and troops get off and vehicles. With each 26 boat group, there was a salvage boat. Now our responsibility was to tow the boats off the beach if they got stuck, or to help them if they had mechanical problems. Our boat had a small bow. It didn't have the big ramp. And so our job was to do that. Also, during operations, we were the command boat in that we had the commander on our boat. The funny story is that in going to this school I was telling you about, for 8 weeks you learned many things, and one of the things you learned was dog stop. And that means if you said to the other boats, dog stop, they are not supposed to go anyplace, stop. Once we got on the ship, our first operation was at San Clemente, California. The day we were landing, the surf was very small and the swells were close together, and we noticed that boats were getting stuck on the beach. So the commander said, let's stop them. We went across all the boats on our ship, the 26 boats. Dog stop, dog stop. Not one boat stopped. They all hit the beach. So that was the first thing that happened that day. Another thing that happened, it was something that we were taught, and it is when you towed boats off the beach, you towed them by the stern. And you watched the boat, and when a swell was going to hit the boat, you backed off on the throttle to let the boat rise above the swell. While we were backing off, one of the guys said, look at that ship out there. It's a four-stacker. We all looked at the ship and felt a jolt. we turned around, and there was no boat, and 4 people swimming in the water. We had sunk the boat. So what we did was take the line from the boat, go back to the beach, make a stake, and tie it to it so they could find the boat. We went on to San Francisco to load up for our first trip to sea. And I thought, well, that was the end of that boat. Unfortunately, they put it on a flat car, sent it to San Francisco, put it back on the ship. We had to tear the complete engine of the boat down, rebuild it, clean it up, because unfortunately we were the ones that sunk it. So anyway.
How many men were on your ship?
I think around 500. And we kicked. My gum is, which I shouldn't chew in the first place. Something sounds like this. I think there was around 500 people on the ship. And you had your regular boat crew, and then you had your amphibious force, and we were the amphibious group. The Lanier was an attack transport, and what we did was carry troops and land them on the beach during operations. So once our first trip to sea, we went from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor, spent some time there, had some more operations.
Do you remember the date of that?
Let's see. Can you cut that off and on, or does it just keep running? Okay, in February of 1945, we loaded our first troops and civilians at that point and headed for Pearl Harbor. We arrived in Pearl March the 2nd, spent some time there, did some operations on Maui, again, mock landings. We then loaded up again and went from there to, from there we went to Eniwetok. Eniwetok was an island that we went to for recreation. It was a little island, and what it had on it was one tree. And you couldn't sit under the tree because there were all land crabs under it. So if you had liberty, what you did was go ashore, you got 2 beers and 2 Cokes, and you sat there all day. Fortunately, I never did it. I would always volunteer for the boat duty, and we could do the boat duty on our landing craft. And fortunately, we had a diving mask. So while everybody was swimming, we'd play around with the diving mask and get down and look at the fish and so on. Now here it is today, and that was World War II, and you think of all the great things they had then. Well, the way we used the diving mask was that we had a mask with a rubber tube on it for air. And the way we had the air was that you had what looked like these old hot water tanks with a crank, and you'd have to crank. Now you would think there would be a motor on it. So anyway, we would take turns. Okay, it's your turn to crank. So we'd crank and somebody else would go down. Anyway, we did that, and then from there we went to Saipan and loaded up again, and on the 17th of April 45, we headed for Iwo Jima. We went to Iwo Jima. There's some question whether the campaign was still going on or not, because it was right for the last couple of days. We unloaded our troops, and for the first time we encountered kamikazes. And fortunately they flew around and got our attention, but they didn't hit anybody at that time.
Did they try?
No, they didn't even try. They just flew around and went back. So we went from there back to Saipan again. We loaded up and we headed for Okinawa. And we were in Okinawa shortly after D-Day. In fact, let's see. In May the 6th, 1945, it seems that we were approaching Okinawa. For the first time, we came under enemy fire and kamikazes. Now, at that time, we didn't get hit, but other ships with us, several of them got sunk that night. And we unloaded our troops, landed them, and we were there for about a day. The next morning, we started picking up casualties, which were a lot of the guys that we had unloaded the night before. And anyway, we picked up our casualties. I think this was the first time that no one had to tell me to put on my helmet and put on my life jacket. So anyway, we were at Okinawa, unloaded our troops. On the way out, we had about one day out, we had to bury a Marine at sea who had been shot, of course, on Okinawa. And we went back to Saipan and unloaded our troops, and then we picked up the crew from a destroyer called the USS Little that had been sunk on the picket line out of Okinawa. They had taken, I forget, like 4 or 5 kamikazes. It's sunken. So we picked that crew up and we took them back to, I think we took them back to Seattle. No, we took them back to San Francisco, unloaded them, and then went to Seattle where we loaded up troops again and back to sea. So.
What was your experience with the men you were loading up and the ones you were leaving? What was the feeling of that?
And I hate to say it, it all became just somewhat routine. You had the troops on, they would be on there several days. They let you do your job, and they did whatever they did, which by the way, was mainly play cards all day, well, the ones that you observed. The same way in the Navy. We had people that played hearts from morning to night, or acey-deucey, which was a board game. The only thing I can say about the troops, the ones you would talk to felt that they were certainly happy that they were getting off the ship, and they felt we were endangered because we had to stay on the ship. My thought was, I'd rather sleep on this ship than be over on the beach with somebody shooting at you. But it's amazing, these people, you know, you'd think they'd look at you and say, well, gee, you're fortunate. You're here, you get chow 3 times a day. And it wasn't. So many of them thought, no, I'd much rather go ashore. So anyway.
It's been about 18 minutes.
Okay.
How did you stay in touch with your family or friends back at home?
Oh, you didn't. You wrote letters, but usually by the time they got the letter, it was all blacked out. In fact, one of the things I used to do, I used to write letters. I was raised by my grandmother, my grandparents. I would say I'd have letter writing days. I might sit down and write 5 different letters and date them different times and send them to my grandmother, because every day was the same, except she liked to get letters, and of course I always liked to get letters back, you know, in mail call. But other than that, you really couldn't keep in touch too well except for the letters. And then what would happen, you might be at sea for a couple of weeks, and when you got to port, they were all mailed at once. And then it may be a long time before your mail caught up with you. I must say it was a very happy day when you did get mail call and you got something.
Were y'all aware of what was going on in the United States or with the war?
We were aware of what was going on with the war, but this is interesting because like at Okinawa, when we were at Okinawa, the way we would find out what was going on sometimes over on the island on the other side was that you would get the news back from the States. So it would go from someone on Okinawa back to the States, and then the news would come back to us. That way you'd know. Now I will say this, like during the invasion of Okinawa, sitting on the ship with your binoculars, it was like watching a movie. I mean, you would see the flamethrowers, and you would could see the tanks and what have you. And then the other thing too was that it was daylight, like 24 hours a day, because the star shells would be, as soon as they'd shoot one, another one, you know, and everything stayed lit up. And
Did you feel afraid at that time?
not really. In fact, after the war, I had lunch with our old skipper, McGowan, and he lived in Fort Worth, Texas, and I lived in Dallas then. And he said to me, he said, you know, we were certainly frightened at times, weren't we? And I thought to myself, I guess maybe at 18 years old, I never got frightened. The only time I was ever frightened, as I say, or was concerned, is when I was on my machine gun with my life jacket and my helmet on, landing at Iwo Jima in Okinawa. But other than that, now there were times when we would pick up submarines, and the DEs and the destroyers would come around and drop their charges. Well, we never paid, the only thing we were interested in, and anyone that was with me, was watching to see if they got the submarine. You never worried about this guy's going to torpedo you. So there is really, on my part, never any worry. Okay. Oh, another thing that happened too, on one of the trips, I had a friend that I grew up with, and I was always on the lookout for him. And we were in Ulithi, which is another recreation island. And we were there for several days, and I happened to notice his ship. So we got together and spent the day. Well, he was kind of a rowdy kid, and he had a chief's cap that he carried in his back pocket. So I got someone to take me over to his ship. We went ashore at Ulithi, and he had a letter signed by the captain that he evidently forged. And the two of us got one case of beer between us. We sat and drank that beer, and everybody wanted to buy it. We would not sell it to them until to a point, you know, then we gave it away. But that's some of the funny things that happened. And I guess I didn't, for that one day we spent together, I didn't see him again until way after the war. And by that time I had moved back to Virginia, but I was only there 6 months, and I moved from there to St. Louis, and so I kind of lost track. Another thing that happened too, and now this was April 14th, 45. We were in Ulithi, and we had a load of troops we were headed back to the States with. And we took off at night. We were diverted to Guam. We went into Guam and unloaded our troops, reloaded with the, and I'll give you, can we cut this off a second? Please. Okay. On our way back to the States, just a half a day out of Guam, in the night, in the middle of the night, we were diverted to Guam. Went into Guam, we unloaded the troops going back to the States, and we loaded up with in record time with the combat Marines, which was the 4th Regiment of the 6th Marines, 10 war correspondents, which was which was United Press, New York Times, LA Times, US papers, English papers, Australian papers, And this group was the, yeah. Okay. This was a group that had gotten chased out of China earlier in the war, and they were given the honor of being the first troops to go back to Japan, or go to Japan when the war ended. While we were in the harbor, evidently different ships got word of the ending of the war. So you'd hear one ship, you'd hear cheering and whistles blowing, and that would subside, and then 10 minutes later you'd hear another one, and it just sort of went around the place. We also, at that time, unloaded ammunition that we were taking back and reloaded with new ammunition. One of the jobs on the ship was that unless you had something very important to do, loading ammunition was a all-hands job. Fortunately, my job was to watch my boat, and when you think of remembering where you were when things happened, when I heard about this being over, I was laying in my boat reading a book called Lady in the Lake. I'll never forget it for some reason. Anyway, we left Guam on the 19th of August in '45, and then on the 27th, we were in Sakami Bay, which was overlooking Fujiyama, Mount Fujiyama, which was a place you never thought you'd get to. So anyway, that was before the war ended. One thing I wish I had, and I'm going to attempt to get a copy of it, I think it was United Press or one of the press services, had a form that they passed out to everyone on the ship, and you put your name on it and the name of your local newspaper, okay? And this was a great article. It's almost like you went in and it was scary going in because you didn't know if people were going to shoot at you. But it was quite a nice article that was written. But what they did was take that article and send it to everybody's hometown newspaper. So it appeared in your local paper.
Did you keep a personal diary while you were there? 'Cause you
Not
said
really.
with the dates.
Well, that's because I went through my book. Oh, otherwise I would have been way off on some things. Now, one of the things that happened, though, that first night we were in, we had to take some correspondents over to the ship that Halsey was on, okay? Now, here you are the first night, and you don't know what's going to happen. And again, being on the salvage boat, anytime there was anything to be done, it was the second best boat on the ship. We always got to do it, okay? So now we're taking the correspondents over to Halsey's ship. But we don't know if somebody's going to shoot at us or not. Because here we are, everything is dark, and we're going around into things. But so we decide, well, what's the recognition signal? Now, we had on our ship, on our boat, we had a radioman. So he was with us, and he was going to obviously let people know the recognition signal. We stopped at several ships, including a battleship and the ship that Halsey was on, if I remember, was an aircraft carrier. Nobody knew what the man-of-war recognition signal was. So we just went and got the people off the boat, waited for them, brought them back to our ship. So anyway, we were there, and on the 30th of August, '45, we landed the first wave of Marines on the beach in Kokosuka Naval Base in Japan. And years later, I was driving someplace, and I was in a filling station and picked up a young sailor, and I was going from Dallas to Shreveport, Louisiana. And I said, well, I was in the Navy, we're talking about him. I said, oh yes, Yokosuka. And he said, sir. I said, yes. He said, that's not Yokosuka, that's Yokosuka. I said, okay. When we landed troops, it was Yokosuka. So anyway, we landed, and as I say, we were, this group of Marines were given the honor of being the first people, the service people, to be landed on the shores of Japan. When we first went there again and landed, you didn't know what was going to happen, whether people were going to shoot at you or what. We came up to a landing craft, a seaplane ramp, and there was a welcoming committee. And there was a whole group of Japanese all in line, and they were there to welcome us. They're very nice, and two things happened. It was kind of amusing, and that is when we were at sea, we would dye our hats blue, white sailor hats. But a lot of the guys would we had to put flags on our boats, American flags on our boats, and paint them on, and we had stencils. Well, they would take these blue hats and put stars around them. Well, some of the poor Japanese people thought there must have been a high-ranking officer. So they would wave, you know, bow to them. Anyway.
Why were the hats painted blue?
So people couldn't spot you at sea at night and such. And but anyway, we met with the welcoming committee. I had a fortunate position in that none of the crew could go ashore. But since I was in the boat with the boat group commander, he kind of let us do what we wanted as long as we stayed within earshot. While I was there, I latched on to a commander in the Japanese Navy because my big interest was getting my hands on a Luger as a souvenir. Got him to take me to the armory. Now, you would think at that point you were afraid, but then once you got there, you weren't. And so anyway, we went to the armory. Again, we'd pass Japanese soldiers, and they'd bow to you. You'd go in the armory, and they had piles of weapons, and each one had a Japanese soldier, and he would bow to you and tell you not to take anything, but you know, you'd take one or two things. While I was in looking for my Luger, which I never found, by the way, they had the first flag raising on Japanese soil right outside of the building. Well, 2 weeks later, I learned from one of the fellows that were with me that he was part of the picture, you know, that they had showed on the news and the movies.
Did you know his name?
Lot.
L-O-T-T?
L-O-T-T.
Do you remember his first name?
No, but it'll be in here.
Look.
Anyway, they had the Marine Band there, the first flag raising, and his wife went to the movies and saw him. Now, if I had been out there and my grandmother had seen me, it would have been the greatest, except here I was in the armory looking for a Luger. So anyway, now after that, I think we were there. Some of the dates I'm not sure of, because the day that the peace treaty was signed, I know that we took the correspondents over to the battleship and we waited for them while the peace treaty was signed. Reading this, it looks like they say that we left the day before, but I'm sure that wasn't the case. It didn't make much difference, but then again.
That must have been very exciting.
It was, yeah, yeah. And then we went back to Saipan again, unloaded some people, loaded up with troops again, and went to Nagasaki, where the atomic bomb had hit not too much time before that. We were in Nagasaki, let me see that. On September the 18th, we were in Nagasaki. Now, we were again there, the first people to go in after the bomb had hit. Now, there's something very interesting about Nagasaki. If you listened to the news or you read the paper, you would think there was nothing there. As you went in and you looked to the left, I mean, it had pretty well wiped out. I mean, just nothing. But if you look to the right, there's a good bit of the town was still there. And one of my jobs, again, being on a salvage boat, the only thing that got in ahead of us that morning were 2 hospital ships. And it's mentioned in there how enjoyable it was when all the nurses were waving to us as we brought the troops in. But anyway, one of the jobs I had, or we had as a boat crew, was to clear the harbor of these small boats that had been sunken and so on. Well, to do that, you had to get out and wade in the water up to your waist, what have you. And I happened to notice some Japanese on the bank, and so I directed them to do it. So I had them, and they got out and did all this job. And each time that they'd do something, I'd throw them some K-rations. And they were very happy about it. The first troop, they came back and they brought 2 chickens for me. They had feet tied up with wire, and I showed them, no, I don't want your chickens. But I also learned too, now here were the Japanese that we had just captured and won the war with. You learn pretty soon that I gave them too many K-rations, because once they got full, they disappeared. So my captives were gone. Now, the other thing was too, now here you're in this war, and you don't like the Japanese because they're shooting at you, and etc. But once you got to Okinawa, or to Nagasaki, you began to feel sorry for these people. I mean, they came down, their feet were in rags, they were in bad shape, and I didn't see any animosity. You know, you'd think that, okay, now that we've beaten you, but I saw no animosity whatsoever towards them. In fact, we helped them out, and even to a point where they had these things, you know, looters will be shot on sight. Well, there happened to be a warehouse right by the docks that was boarded up. So we went and got the boards off, and nobody took anything in our group, but we just kept giving it to the Japanese. And there's some pictures in here of one Japanese person, I think, with about 3 feet of stuff on top and a sewing machine in a hand running away. And anyway, we were there. We walked into town. There were a lot of people. In fact, there were some, just trying to think where they were like monks or something, which were, the people were referred to as White Russians were there. They were Anglos. And so we stayed there only a few days. Then we went from there to Manila, and which was an experience, because first of all, you couldn't get into the inner harbor because there were probably hundreds of ships that were just sunken. And you could see the mast sticking up, in many cases almost the whole ship. And at that time, you almost got the feeling that the people in the Philippines, they really didn't care much who was in charge then, you know, if they get out the American flag or the Japanese flag. There were 2 things that happened there, and that is that we were warned on the ship, when you go ashore, don't drink their liquor because it isn't good for you. Well, a lot of people didn't pay much attention. They would have like American liquor in the same bottle, but instead of like 4 roses, it would be 3 roses. So everything would look the same. They'd have all these things labeled different. They were always buying cigarettes, and they'd buy them by the carton, of course. In the Navy then, you bought them for a nickel a pack, 50 cents a carton. So you always went with cigarettes. But if you saw the first person and they were giving you $2 a carton for cigarettes, you might as well quit then. Now, how they knew, they would maybe change from day to day, whatever the market would bear. And so that was the other thing. Another thing was that I had the liberty duty the first day. And one of the jobs you had, when the guys had spent the day there, At the fleet landing, there was a long place that was just dirt. And there would be sailors laying there, one by one, who had encountered the booze. And it was your job to go along, pick out your guys, and get them back to the ship, and so take them back. I guess going back on the first trip, I saw the biggest brawl I ever saw in my life. I was on what they call an LCM. We had, of the 26 boats, 2 of them were LCMs, which was a larger landing craft. And it had a deep well. There was somebody up on the top that shouldn't have been there, and someone told him to get down. And anyway, one guy slapped another, and he fell down. I guess for 10 minutes, these people fought. I mean, they're just fighting and fighting and fighting. I don't even think they knew who they were fighting, but anyway, that was one of the things that happened in Manila. Other than that, it was very uneventful. It was interesting to see, by the way, because seeing all the ships that were sunken and so on. So anyway, after Manila, we again, it seemed that Saipan was a place that we went back and forth a lot. And we loaded up in Saipan and headed back for the USA. We went back.
When was that?
Oh, okay. And we loaded up in October of '45. We loaded our troops and headed for Seattle, Washington. We were in a storm during that whole period. One night, I had duty up on the flying bridge, and the ship was rolling in really worse than any time I'd seen before. And the captain came up, and he said, "Did you boys just feel that?" "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, the ship is supposed to take a maximum roll of 35 degrees, and we just took a 37.5, and I thought we were going over." But obviously we didn't. We made it all right. We had a lot of seasickness on the ship, mainly with the troops that we were hauling back. And anyway, we got back to Seattle, and we arrived in Seattle in November of the 4th of 1945. When we came in, it's the first time we'd seen anything that resembled what was happening in the U.S. There was a small ship that met us with a band on it and banners, "Welcome home," and they rode beside us all the way through Puget Sound up till the part of debarkation. And so in Seattle, we were there for a while, and on the way back to sea, we were going out, and there was a tugboat towing a barge of oil, and we went right between them. We sunk the barge. Again, getting back to your training, one of the things was, I forget what the whistle was, you know, lifeboat crew, man your lifeboat so you can go pick up the survivors. Nobody ever knew who was the lifeboat crew. After spending a week in Seattle, happened to be a Bremerton ferry coming across, so they picked up the survivors. We had to go into dry dock for some 21 days, which everybody was very happy about, because then we've got liberty every day back in Seattle. Once we got back to sea, we kind of thought that was our last trip, but it wasn't. We had to go from Seattle to Hollandia, New Guinea, where we picked up troops there. And in fact, we were only supposed to pick up part of them. I guess the U.S. had sold everything to the Dutch. The Dutch, all of a sudden, since the ship was in, ordered everybody out. So we took everybody from Hollandia. Then we went to Finschhaven, New Guinea, picked the troops up, brought them back to Long Beach, California, where we disembarked. While we were in Long Beach, that was my last time visiting the Pike. And then, are you familiar with the Pike? Anyway, in Long Beach, the Pike was a long amusement park. And probably about 99% of the people there were sailors. So anyway, that's spent my time at the Pike there. After we left there, we went down through the Panama Canal into Newport News, Virginia. And one day before we started decommissioning, I left the ship, and I was discharged April 14th, 1946, out of, what's the name of the place? Out of Camp Shelton, Virginia, which is known as Little Creek, Virginia, which people in the Navy and service. So that's pretty much my story. Now, you may have questions. And
What did you do in the days and the weeks after you were decommissioned?
after I was decommissioned, the first thing I thought I was going to do was to take a month off and just do nothing.
And you were 20 years old then?
I was 20 years old, yeah. Got tired of doing nothing in a couple of weeks. Looked for a job. Before I went in the service, I had worked for the post office. And when I got out of the Navy, I went back to work at the post office, at Camp Belvoir, Virginia, and worked there and for 6-7 months. At that time, I got married, and my wife's family was moving to St. Louis, and to me, you know, so I decided, okay, I'll go. To show you what a small world this is, though, my wife's father was #2 man in the U.S. Maritime Commission.
What was his name?
John Clark, John Edward Clark. And so one of his cousins came to visit, and his name was Jim, oh, okay, I can't remember right now. Anyway, came to visit, and at that time, his college roommate was the Postmaster General, okay? So he had said to me, Jim Byrne, he said, well, Bob, would you like to go to St. Louis? And I said, yeah, but I don't have a job, and I can't transfer in the post office because, you know, I'm just a temporary employee. And he said, would you mind if I help? I said, no, be my guest. A few days later, I'm working at this little post office in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and the postmaster comes back, and he's very excited. Come to my office. You have a phone call. I go to the office, get on the phone, and this gentleman says, this is George Wheelhouse, Assistant Postmaster General. I understand that you'd like to go to St. Louis. I said, that's true, except that I can't go because I'm just a temporary. Well, don't worry about that. Just put the postmaster on the phone. And not only did I get to go to St. Louis, I got raises back to the time I went in the Navy. It took people 30 years to get day work. I got day work immediately. And so when I got out there, I thought, well, I might as well just continue to play this. So Barney, somebody was the postmaster of St. Louis, so I went to see him. And I said, I would like to see Mr. Barney, whatever his name is. And his secretary said, well, who are you? I said, I'm Crismond. Oh, we've been waiting for you. I mean, he offered me the world. What would you like? But anyway, so that's how I ended up in St. Louis. I lived in St. Louis for 9 years. Then I moved from St. Louis to Dallas, Texas, and spent probably about an equal amount of time there. And from there, I went to Chicago, and from Chicago to L.A., from Los Angeles to Atlanta. I was in Atlanta for 5 or 6 years and got transferred to Summit, New Jersey, and stayed up there, again, about 5 years. We came back one Christmas to visit our married daughter. We were walking the day after Christmas. The sun was bright. It was about 30 degrees, but one of those nice, just crisp days. And I said to my family, come hell or high water, we'll be back this summer. And went back to New Jersey and resigned from the company. Although we weren't back in the summer, it took a few months later. I'd been with the company long enough that they didn't want me to leave to start with. And so I was just going to resign, and they kept after me so much, I finally said to the president, and I was the vice president, and I said, well, look, I'm looking for an Eastern Division manager to be headquartered here in Fairfield, New Jersey. But if you let me move that job to Atlanta, Georgia, I'll stay with the company, which he did. I stayed with the company, and then they transferred me back to Atlanta, and been here ever since. Love it, wouldn't leave.
Did you make many close friendships while you were in the service?
Well, I had some close friends.
Did you keep up with them?
Not really. I had one fellow that I was with. His name is DuPaul, and he lived in Chicago. No, he lived in Detroit. And somewhere I learned that he was going to be in Chicago training. He was with Sears. I called him, spent an evening with him, and that was about it.
Did you ever join a veterans organization?
Never did. I've got a friend that's in the VFW. I went to one meeting with him and really wasn't that interested. In fact, I think everybody there was Army people, and so you couldn't have any war stories, you know.
Do you feel that your military experience influenced your thinking about war or about the military in general?
Not really.
Do you think it affected your life in any way?
Oh, it certainly affected my life.
In what way?
In that I got out. Look, I was originally from Virginia. As far as I'd ever been was to go to Fort Wayne, Indiana once, I think, and then I went to New York when I was 12 years old, a newsboy, for selling X number of subscriptions. So I'd never really been away from home. I went in the service. I must say that one day I left and I thought I was going to be homesick, and I wasn't. I fell into place, you know, when I went there. Again, back to funny things that happened. While I was in Camp Perry, I had guard duty one night with a fella, and we were running because we were late, and it was the mid-watch. And they had catwalks around there, boardwalks every place. And all of a sudden we're running, he's behind me, and wham, he falls down. And he panics. He keeps saying, I'm paralyzed, I'm paralyzed. And he was really upset. So I went back and I sat by him, and what happened was, it was that, you know, you're just out of your sleep and you wake and you're still wearing your boots from boot camp. Well, the hooks are on the outside. He had put the things on the inside, and all of a sudden, as he was running, the hooks caught and his legs locked. But if you could have heard him, I mean, oh man, he was really panicking. But no, back to the Navy. I didn't have any qualms about coming home and being there for 6 months and leaving. I, by the way, have, although I've been a vice president I was vice president general manager of a division of Ticketron of the 13 western states. I was a vice president with TRW in 2 different divisions. I was vice president of a company called General Automation, which was in Anaheim, California. And I didn't have any qualms about leaving, and even though that, I guess my big thing is I'm a salesman. I think I got my first promotion of any consequence because the people in the company felt if I didn't get it, I'd quit, and I probably would fail. Obviously, I didn't fail. But so I learned a lot in the service, and I'm sure I grew up a lot. When I think of some of the funny things that happened, I can say that most of us were kids, and we acted like 17, 18, 19-year-olds, and that's probably...
It's still a lot of responsibility for us.
It was a lot of responsibility. We didn't feel put upon. I mean, that was just part of our job, whatever we did. And now when we look at 18-year-olds, they look pretty young. Oh, and as my wife says to me, she has the pictures of me, I look like I'm 12 years old. But no, it was a great experience. When the war was over, I would like to have gone to Europe and seen more of the world, quite truthfully. And at that time, when you were being discharged, they'd promise you anything. But then I learned, too, they'd promise you and somewhere it would fall through the cracks. I was about to re-enlist for a year. And then I got thinking, too, well, gee, maybe all the jobs will be gone. So I'd grown up enough to realize that. So I took my discharge, as I say, April the 14th, 46, and headed back to Virginia.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't covered?
No, I'm sure that when I was doing my notes, there are things in there that I would have covered, but I didn't. But the main thing was that that I'm most pleased about is the fact that the ship that I was on landed the first troops in Japan, actually before the peace treaty was ever signed. And the thing that disappointed me, though, was when it was the 50th anniversary, that being the USS Lanier, that no one seemed to be interested. And then later, at about maybe 3 or 4 years ago, another anniversary, I read things that people had sent in, which it's like an explanation about Nagasaki. Now, it's obvious these people that they were quoting was looking that way and not this way, because, you know, they would say, well, the destruction and the dead people laying around. I was there the first day anyone was there, and I didn't see any dead people laying around. I saw a lot of destruction, but again, if you looked this way, and you'll see pictures in there, in fact, of the town in this document I left with you guys. So, but I have no regrets. I enjoyed being in the service. And I'm mighty glad that I have friends. I have one friend that, as far as he got, was Bainbridge, Maryland, and his family was somewhat influential, and that's where he stayed. I'm much happier that I did what I did and got to Okinawa and Japan and Iwo Jima, etc.
Well, we thank you very much for coming in and sharing and for leaving the document with us.
You're welcome.